Hi, my name is Patrick Kennedy, and today I'm going to be answering the question, how are requests processed in Flask? The goal of this talk is to provide an in-depth walkthrough of how requests are processed in Flask. First, I'll show the steps that occur before and after a view function is executed in Flask. And second, I'll highlight the callbacks that are available at different points in the request processing sequence, as they can be really beneficial to use in your Flask application. So the topics that I'll be covering during this talk are the request response cycle and how that applies to a Flask application. What are the steps that occur before a view function is executed? And then what are all the steps after the view function is executed? And finally, I'll talk about the callbacks that are available as part of this sequence, which you can use to power up your Flask applications. So, when developing a web application with Flask, we're focused on processing requests and then generating responses back. So, in this case here, when you enter a URL into your web browser, the request gets sent to the web server, which then passes it on to the Whiskey server. And the Whiskey server creates a standard interface between a web server and a Python application, which here in our example is a Flask application. So then the Flask application takes that request, processes it, and generates a response, which then gets sent back through the Whiskey server, web server, and back to the web browser for the user to see. So, expanding on the Flask application portion of this diagram, we'll typically have a view function that's decorated with either route, get, post, delete, patch, something like that. And that's going to handle the request and generate a response. So in this case here, when the home page is accessed, then the index view function is executed and the hello world string gets returned. So what I want to talk about here now is what are all the steps that happen before this view function gets executed and after the view function is executed. So this is a diagram of most of the steps that occur before and after a view function is executed. Now, I know this diagram has a lot of steps, so we'll be going through each one in this sequence, and then later on in the presentation, I'll also be highlighting the callbacks that are available as part of the sequence. Now, I really think it's important to learn all these steps that are occurring, not only just to get an insight of how Flask works when it's processing a request, but I think it's also really important to understand what callbacks are available and at what point in this sequence. This really can just be powerful for your Flask application for doing specific things. All right, so now let's look at the steps that occur before a view function is executed. Really, the goal of these steps is to prepare the necessary data and contexts for the view function to use. So starting off, the Whiskey interface is going to pass in an environment object, which the Flask application will take and convert into a request object. So this is going to contain things like the URL, what HTTP method is being used, things like that. Next, the application context gets pushed onto the stack. So the application context is what's used to keep track of application level data, like configuration variables and the logger, things like that. So with the application context pushed onto the stack, we now have the current app proxy available and G for storing global data throughout this sequence of events. Next, the request context is pushed onto the stack, and most of this data is going to come from that environment object from the Whiskey server. And this is going to keep track of the request level data, like the URL, the HTTP method, get, post, delete, things like that. Any headers, any data in the request, and also the session data, if it's available. This step makes available the request proxy which can be used to access request data, and also the session data, which is used for storing data like between different requests. Next, the session data gets loaded using the session interface. And this is a really powerful feature of Flask because the session interface allows you to use either the default configuration for Flask, which is client-side sessions, or you could use a Flask extension such as Flask Session for server-side sessions. So it's up to you how you want to use this. All right, next is a big step, which is URL matching. So this means taking the URL that came in, so what's the web address that's trying to be accessed, and figuring out if there's a correct view function available to process that URL. And so this is basically saying, is there a function that's decorated with route or one of the shortcut decorators that can handle the URL? Now, if there's no match found, an error is going to be stored, and that's going to get processed later just before the view function gets executed. All right, the next step is the first of a number of callbacks that we're going to look at throughout the sequence. And this is called URL value preprocessor. So at this point, any functions that are decorated with URL value preprocessor are going to be executed. And this can be really beneficial for modifying the URL values that get passed into the view function. And I will show an example of how to use this callback later in the presentation, as well as all the other callbacks that are mentioned in this sequence. All right, now the last step before the view function is executed is calling any functions decorated with the before request decorator. This is really beneficial for loading any data that's going to be needed by the view function. So this could be establishing a database connection. This could be loading any user data that you may need for your view functions. And again, I'll get into a couple of examples of how to use this decorator later in the presentation. Okay, so now with that, everything's been prepared and the view function gets executed if there's been no exceptions generated up to this point. So now we're going to talk about what happens after the view function. And there's a number of steps that occur here. And really the goal of these steps is going to be to generate the response and also to clean up the contexts that have been used throughout this sequence. So that's the application context and request context. All right, so let's step through each one of these to see what's happening. Okay, so first, if there's been any errors generated up to this point, and there's a matching error handler decorated function, it will get executed now. So this error handler callback is really nice for creating custom error pages in your Flask application. And I think that really gives a Flask application a nice experience for using it. And I'll show an example of this again later in the presentation. Next, any functions that are decorated with the after this request are executed. And so both after this request and after request, which is the next step, are really good for modifying the response before it actually gets returned to the user. The big thing about this callback is that it's going to be set only for specific URLs. So really it's up to the view function to determine whether or not it wants to create a callback using the after this request. And again, I'll show an example later on to demonstrate this. Next, any functions decorated with after request are executed. And the key thing here is that these functions that are decorated with after request are always going to be executed, whereas the previous step using after this request are just going to be for very specific instances. All right, next, the session data is saved so that it can be used as part of processing any subsequent requests. With that, we have everything ready to go to generate a response. So a response object is created and returned to the Whiskey server, which then goes back to the web server and back to the web browser for the user to see. So you see at this point, the steps kind of 1 through 4 have been really preparing to get the response generated. And then the steps afterwards are going to be for cleaning up contexts. All right, so next what happens is any functions decorated with teardown requests will be executed. And these callbacks are really good for cleaning up resources once we're all done processing a request and the response has been sent out. So both teardown request and teardown app context, coming up a little bit later, are good for cleaning up resources like closing database connections. All right, so now that this callback has been executed, the request context will actually be popped from the stack, which means that the request proxy and session are no longer available to use. Next, any functions decorated with teardown app context will be executed. And again, this is a good place for cleaning up resources after a request is done processing. And I guess the subsequent step is then to pop the application context from the stack, which then makes current app in G no longer available. And with that, the request processing is done. And everything has been cleaned up. So, looking back at the sequence of steps, I've highlighted a number of the steps that are actually callbacks that you can use in a Flask application. And these callbacks can be used as decorators to invoke specific functions at specific steps in this request process. And so I kind of want to walk through each of these callbacks to show kind of what their purpose is and give an example for each one of them. Okay, so the first callback that's available is called URL value preprocessor. And the purpose of this callback is to either read or modify the URL information before it actually gets passed to the view function. So the example I show here is, let's say you have a Flask social media application. And you have a route for viewing the profile page of different users. So the route has a variable called username. And if you create a function that's decorated with the URL value preprocessor, you can actually pop that username from the list of values and store that in using G, so kind of global data. And so now when the profile page view function is executed, there's actually no argument that gets passed in because you've already popped that username from the list of values, but you've already stored it now in G, so it's just available to use, whether you want to return it there in like that string, or you can use it in other places such as templates. A really great example of using URL value preprocessor is available in the Flask documentation. I have a link down there below. And it shows how to read the language code in a URL using the URL value preprocessor decorator. It's a great example. So the next callback is before request. And so this is the step that it gets executed just before a view function is called. And the purpose of this callback is to execute any functions to load data that may be needed by the view functions. So I have two examples here. The first one is one that I use all the time whenever I create an administrative blueprint. I always want to check that the current user is actually an admin and has the correct authority or authorization to view the admin pages. So if you use the before request decorator, you can then check that the user actually is an admin. And if they're not, you can abort with a 403 forbidden error code. And what's really interesting to note here is that if you do return a none value from a before request decorated function, the view function will not execute. It'll just be completely skipped, and you'll move down the sequence to clean up the request. In the second example, I'm creating a connection to a SQLite database, again using the before request decorator. And so this will load up a database connection so that it's available for the view function to use. So as these examples show, the decorator can be used both at the application level, as in the second example, or at the blueprint level, as in the first example. Another example of a before request callback can be found in the Flask WTF forms code. They actually use it to check for a CSRF token. And you can see the GitHub link down there below to look into that a little bit more. Okay, error handler. So this is a really graceful way to handle specific HTTP error codes. I really like using this to create custom error pages that allow you to have links to maybe to get back to the home page or get back to some common point in your application. So you use the error handler decorator, passing in a specific error code, and then you can render a template like I do in these examples here, and it just gives a nice feel to the web application. Okay, so after this request, so this is used to execute a function to modify the response, but it's only used for specific requests. So I really think it's going to be up to the view function to specify that it wants to have this callback executed. So in this case here, we have a profile view function that's going to that's going to create a function called remember theme, and that's going to be decorated with the after this request. So that will mean that when this specific URL is called, then this function should be called during that after this request step. And one thing to note about using after this request is that you need to make sure to import it from Flask in order to use it. So it's kind of a different usage than all the other callbacks we've looked at. So again, main thing here is to highlight that this is used for specific requests. If you want something to execute after every request, then you want to use the after request decorator. And in this example here, I'm modifying the header and the response after every request is processed. One thing to note here when using the after request callback is that you need to pass in the response, then you can make any modifications, and then you also need to return the response. Because again, the key thing with this callback is modifying response. That's really its purpose. If you want to see another example, the Flask login extension uses after request to handle the remember me cookie, which is you'll find that a lot of times like in login screens to keep a user logged in for an extended period of time. All right, the last two callbacks that I want to highlight are the teardown request and teardown app context. So these are both used for cleaning up resources after the request has been processed. So if you remember back to the sequence, these are both going to be executed after the response has already been returned through the WSGI interface into the web server, into the web browser. So an example here would be if you want to close the connection to a SQLite database. You could use either teardown app context or teardown request as the decorator. And then you create your function to check if the database connection is there, and if so, close it. I think the key thing to highlight between these two different callbacks is really what contexts are available in each of these callbacks. So teardown request actually executes first. So you're going to have the request, session, current app, and G all available to you. But then between these two, the request context gets popped from the stack. So then when teardown app context executes, you'll only have current app and G available to use. So in conclusion, I think there's a lot of really interesting steps that occur before and after a view function is executed in Flask. And I think it's really beneficial to learn about them just from understanding how Flask works, but also figuring out like which callbacks may be beneficial to use like in your Flask application. And as you can see, there's a long list of callbacks available. They all kind of serve a different purpose since they execute at different points within that request processing sequence. I'd really like to say a huge thank you to the Flask maintainers for just creating such an amazing tool and just creating such an amazing community. Like, I'm so happy to be part of it. And I also want to say thank you to the FlaskCon organizers for putting together this great conference. And just want to say thank you to everybody for all your hard work. Really appreciate it. So with that, are there any questions? Thank you very much.